I've been meaning to do vlogs for a long time, but I just haven't been able to find the time. Now I suddenly have it. And a lot of us are sitting around these days looking for content on the internet. And after giving it some thought, I realized what better content is there on the entire internet than me? People comment to me things like, you don't look like a guy who would drive a Mustang, or you don't look like a guy who would wear a leather jacket, which have always felt to me like more eloquent ways of saying, ha ha, nerd. So our vlog topic for today, surprisingly, is going to be men's fragrances. Now, prior to the start of the year, I probably hadn't worn any kind of cologne in 20 years, literally maybe not since high school. I've always had allergies, and they tended to be worse when I was younger. They've seemed to have gotten progressively better since I've gotten older. Nowadays, something might bother me initially, like a dog or a cologne or something like that, but usually within a couple of days, my body seems to adjust to it. I really hadn't thought about fragrances or colognes in probably, again, 20 years or so until last year, when one of my friends, actually one of my old college roommates, had kind of gotten into it as a hobby. I went down to Panama City Beach to visit him last summer, and right about the time was when he had really kind of started to get into it. So the whole time that I was down there, he was constantly pulling out these different fragrances and spraying them for me to smell. He was doing hurricane relief sort of cleanup at the time, this really blue-collar work. He lived across the street from the guys that he was working for. So when we would go over there to talk to them, he would bring his colognes and perfumes along and spray them and get those guys to smell those. And that always struck me as funny. It kind of worked for him because they knew him and they knew his personality. But I was just thinking, like, what if I had done that? What if just this random stranger had suddenly showed up at their doorstep with him being like, hey guys, smell these perfumes? Since then, I guess I've learned that this is a much bigger hobby than I realized it was. These days with YouTube, you can find all these different sort of little niche hobbies that are out there. Sort of developed some favorite YouTube channels where I like to watch fragrance review videos, and it's always impressive to me to see the variety of personalities on there. There's everything from this sort of European pretty boy who likes to spin around to this African-American guy who says F the box and literally like crumples up the box and throws it away. It's a very eclectic community, much more so than I would have really realized. Now, me personally, I've probably tried about 30 to 35 different men's fragrances since the beginning of the year, and immediately I've seen how addicting it can be. Of course, prior to coronavirus, you could have just gone to your local Macy's or Dillard's or something like that to sample some of these, but I don't really have one close to me anyway, and so I was typically just ordering these vials off of eBay or off of online fragrance shops for usually about $5 or $6. I do think that gives you an advantage in a way, because trying to go to a shop and test several of these at one time, I think your nose is basically just going to get overwhelmed. And on top of that, the opening of a lot of these scents is not really the same as the dry down once it kind of settles onto you in 20 minutes or so. And so really, in order to get a true appreciation for them, you can't just go and sort of machine gun blast these at a Macy's or Dillard's, because you're not going to get a true appreciation for them. If you're interested in it, you really need to buy them and sort of wear it for a while and kind of see how it sits on your skin. I've definitely noticed that some of my initial impressions of fragrances have changed as I've kind of given it a little bit more time. There have been a couple that I didn't really like initially and then come to really love later, or vice versa, something that I thought, oh, that smells pretty good, but after letting it sit for a while, it didn't have the same appeal. I think one thing I've learned about my own tastes is that they're somewhat limited. There aren't really a ton of different types of scents that I really like. There's a couple that I really kind of gravitate towards. In the fragrance world, there's everything from aquatic to woodsy to fruity to oriental spicy, powdery, leathery, floral, fresh green fragrances, soapy, and so on. Personally, I tend to kind of gravitate toward the ones that are aquatic or fruity or leathery or sometimes woodsy. Out of the 35 or so that I've sampled, there's really probably been 4 that I've really liked so far. And it kind of reminds me of being a sports photojournalist, where you could shoot hundreds of shots from a game and you might find a handful that you actually really liked and wanted to use. If I remember right, smell is your sense that's most closely tied to memory. So I haven't really done research on this at this point, but I'm kind of curious to know what the connections are there between colognes that people prefer and how they're tied to maybe a memory that you've had in life. That's kind of funny to see on some of the YouTube channels because some of these reviewers will go from talking about the actual notes within the fragrance to giving it sort of a narrative description like, this is what James Bond smells like, or this is what Christmas smells like. But the thing with fragrances is they're so subjective. So what smells like James Bond to me might smell like something completely different to you. What smells like Christmas to me might smell like something completely different to you. One thing that's nice and interesting about fragrances is that unlike something like a car or clothing, expensive doesn't always equal better. One of my favorite fragrances is Coach for Men, and you can get it for about $35 or so online for a bottle that's about 3.3 ounces. You compare that to something like Creed Aventus, which is one of the most universally popular fragrances out there, it goes for about $400 or so for the same size bottle. The funny part is I normally tend to have expensive tastes on most everything. I don't intentionally do that. It's just I see something and I'm like, oh, that looks really good. And then I find out that it's the most expensive version of whatever product we're talking about. But with colognes, it doesn't seem to be that way. Actually, the more really expensive ones that I've sampled tend to be the ones that I don't like. The other thing is that some scents smell good, but they don't necessarily smell like something I would want to wear. There's one that I tried called Halloween Man X, which is actually a pretty cheap fragrance that a lot of people tend to like. And to me, it just smells like coffee. It smells good. I like the smell of coffee, but I don't necessarily want to wear coffee. I don't want to go around smelling like I spilled coffee over myself. It's a nice scent, but it's just not something I want to wear. And I've kind of found that that's true of certain fragrances. Now, if you're not really familiar with that world, really all kinds of companies make men's fragrances. Versace, Coach, even car companies like Mercedes-Benz or Bentley. There are also all these different types of concentrations for the fragrances where there's everything from eau de toilette to eau de parfum to parfum. And basically those tend to dictate how strong of a scent that it is. So that's something that I had to learn. There were a couple of fragrances that I had heard a lot of good things about. I bought what I thought was that version, and then it turned out to be a slightly different version. Wasn't impressed at all. And then later on, I got the actual version and I was like, oh, okay, yeah, I see what the appeal is here. I don't really want to use this video to get into a lot of specific fragrances. Each one could sort of be its own video. And that's how a lot of YouTube reviewers tend to approach things. So I did mention Coach for Men, and I think I held up this one, Acqua di Gio Profumo, at the very beginning. Those two tend to be my favorites out of what I've sampled so far. So maybe I'll do specific videos on those. I really just kind of wanted to keep this more general. So in the comments, let me know what you think about all this. Do you have a cologne that you've worn for 20 years? Do you ever sample this type of thing? Or is it something that you've sort of thought of as a sort of a women's topic? I'm really curious to know what everyone else's experience has been with this because it's a world that was just completely off of my radar really since high school. I might actually do some more specific reviews like I talked about of individual colognes if people have any interest in this, but I think it's pretty interesting. So tell me what you think about it.